And without further ado, I want to welcome Nicole Rycroft. Hi, Nicole. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah,
So
it's great
Nicole
to
is
be
the
here.
founder. Yeah, welcome. Nicole is the founder and executive director of Canopy, an environmental nonprofit based in Vancouver, focused on protecting the world's forests by working with the forest industry's biggest customers and suppliers. Nicole has won many awards. We're going to hear all about her, hopefully about her journey today, but I'll highlight that she's an Ashoka Fellow, and last year she won the Climate Breakthrough Award, the 2020 Climate Breakthrough Award, being awarded $3 million to support her groundbreaking work. So welcome, Nicole.
Thanks.
And hosting the conversation, we've got Barnaby Geitz, so formerly CSI's Director of Programs, now our Executive Director for Climate Ventures. Barnaby's worked with CSI for 10 years and was recently recognized for his work supporting social entrepreneurs and social enterprises by being one of 50 emerging changemakers in the Globe and Mail's Report on Business, among many other accolades. So thanks, Barnaby. With that, I will pitch it over to you, and then I will disappear in the background.
Thank you so much, Shay. Hi, Nicole, and welcome. Maybe we'll just start with asking you where you're joining us from today.
Yeah, hey, Barnaby, it's great to be here. I'm joining you from Vancouver, British Columbia, so way out on the west coast, from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, so the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'm delighted to be here, and it's a bright, sunny day in Vancouver.
Yeah, that looks beautiful behind you.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit, for those who don't know yet, about Canopy's vision and mission?
Sure. So Canopy is a solutions-driven, not-for-profit organization. Our vision is a world where natural ecosystems are healthy and vibrant, supporting flourishing life on Earth, where our societies are just and diverse, and our economy operates within the bounds of our planet's natural capital, and that government and industry decision makers account for the kind of inherent value of nature and its kind of biological diversity just as naturally as they do around social and economic considerations. Our mission is to protect the world's forests. Perhaps that's a bit of a spoiler alert, I guess, for our mission, which is to protect the world's forests, species, climate, and to help advance frontline community rights. And we do that by harnessing the power of the marketplace.
Great, thank you. So in these conversations, we like to get a sense of people's journeys. I'm sure there's a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs and established entrepreneurs that relate to the journey of entrepreneurs that we profile here. So I was curious about how your journey started, because from what I read, you were born in Australia, and I can detect the slight accent. You're a physiotherapist, an elite level athlete. And then since then, as Shay mentioned, you've been recognized as an Ashoka Fellow, which is one of the highest distinctions in social entrepreneurship. You're the recipient of a Canadian Environment Award Gold Medal, a winner of the $3 million US 2020 Climate Breakthrough Award, a recipient of the Meritorious Service Cross of Canada. So it seems like almost two different lives, or at the very least, two different career paths. So I was wondering if you could describe that journey to us a little bit.
Sure, happy to. And yes, my Australian roots is immediately given away every time I even, refer to you by name, right? Barnaby. Like it's impossible for me to say a word that has an R in the middle of it and not be immediately outed as an Aussie. But yeah, like many of us in life, I've had a circuitous path to where I've ended up, but have always had a passion for wild places. My grandmother had a really infectious love of the Australian bush and wildlife documentaries, and I feel really lucky to have kind of that rubbed off on me. There's also something about growing up in Australia and in close proximity to the Australian bush or forests. And there's just an intensity to it. It's hot. It's really pungent because the eucalyptus oils, as we were speaking just before we came live, are released in the heat. And so it's it smells fantastic, and it's really noisy. Cicadas, birds, cockatoos, and galahs. And so I think it's just so intense, it kind of gets woven into your fabric. And so I've, even though I, went to university to be a physiotherapist, and then I spent time as an elite level athlete, I always had a gravitational pull towards social justice issues more broadly, and environmental protection. And of course, when you think about being a physio and being an elite athlete, it seems as though it's got nothing to do whatsoever with, running an international NGO and transforming unsustainable supply chains. But in retrospect, in some ways, it was actually the perfect training, right? Like as a physio, if you're a good physio, then you don't just treat the symptom, you actually look for what the underlying cause is and worked to address and rectify that. And, being an athlete, you have to be willing to just get up and do it again and again and again. And tenacity really pays its dues in this line of work. So those are my roots. I kind of read quite widely about social justice issues and really iconic movements in the past to analyze where were those levers, where they really kind of were able to have those breakthrough moments. I've always been a bit of a history buff, and so that's always been of interest. And before I moved to Canada, I spent a couple of years in Southeast Asia doing volunteer human rights and environmental work. And it was kind of really as I was doing some volunteer work on the Burmese border, documenting the link between human rights violations and environmental degradation, that kind of broader analysis of having read about the apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement and the civil rights movement, and kind of the suffragists, that just kind of the context of the global economy and how it's driving so many of the kind of environmental and human rights issues that we're grappling with really kind of crystallized for me. And that we live in this supply and demand world. And so why not harness the purchasing and the kind of then social influence of the demand side of things to help drive positive change? Like we don't have to leave this kind of trail of destruction behind. And so I was moving to Canada and felt with moving to North America, I was moving to the belly of the beast of consumption. And what better place to try and start kind of shifting and harnessing that purchasing influence, that social and broader economic influence to drive positive change. So I started Canopy in 1999 with an $1,800 budget, and basically just with the belief that we could be doing things in a smarter way, that we didn't need to be cutting down 800-year-old trees like we're continuing to do in British Columbia to make pizza boxes and t-shirts. So that's the long rambling story as to how I got here.
No, that was great. Thank you. In your annual report, you open it by referring to reflecting on the link between the pandemic and environmental destruction, recalling the devastating forest fires in Australia and the torching of the Amazon under Bolsonaro. Can you tell us just a bit more about what's at stake right now with the world's forests, and what are the threats and what will the results be if we don't act?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure everybody who's listening is pretty aware of the context of our times, right? Anybody who reads the newspaper, anybody who reads a scientific journal is, probably tempted to reach for a bottle of wine fairly closely afterwards. Like, all of our indicators are heading in the wrong direction for the most part. The thing that really buoys me in work is just an appreciation for the fact that forests are so foundational for life on Earth. Right? Our relationship with forests starts the very moment that we're born, when we draw our first breath. And I find that to be a really beautiful thing and connection, that they're responsible for providing us with clean air and clean water and creating precipitation and then drawing it across continents, and that protecting forests is the fastest and most economic way for us to stabilize our climate, like just to keep forests standing. that conserving forests represents 30% of the climate solution, and that 80% of the species that we share this planet with are terrestrial species anyway. Coal forests, they're home. And so, I think the reality is it's very clear we're logging too much too fast. There are 3.2 billion trees that disappear into packaging and clothing every year. And, just as I said a little earlier, like we don't need to use 800-year-old trees to make shipping boxes and clothing. But that's exactly what's happening. And so I think that's the kind of global context of what's happening. And even here in Canada, in British Columbia, there's less than 3% of high productive forests, old growth forests left. And they're being logged at an accelerated rate. People are being, arrested this week trying to stop that. So we are at, people talk about this being the turnaround decade. We are really kind of like in a turnaround decade where we need to just make smarter choices. Yeah, some drastic changes.
Well, you've been working on solutions for 20 years. You told us about your journey, and I would imagine that when you started Canopy, you did not know yet all the solutions that you would be trying and then succeeding at. And then I just wonder, when you look back, are there a few of those solutions or moments? You actually have a great timeline on your website that kind of tracks the 20-year history and successes of your organization, and we can share that in the chat. But I'm wondering which ones stand out to you as really critical moments for your work and for Canopy.
Ooh, that's really interesting. Okay, there's a couple that pop to mind, and this is probably like asking a parent about their favorite child. So I think it's hard to ignore our work to green the Harry Potter book series. So the work that we did with the Canadian publisher Raincoast Books in grading the Harry Potter book series, the 5th book in that series, and how it went on with the support of J.K. Rowling to, be the greenest book in history by the time the 7th book was published, and how that triggered a broader revolution in the way that book publishing is done globally, with the Canadian book industry spearheading that. So that would be one. I think the work that we did to support the Great Bear Rainforest agreements. So we weren't sitting at the day-to-day negotiations table like our environmental allies and First Nations, but we engaged the influence of the marketplace at really key junctures to help incentivize the forest industry and the BC government to change business as usual practice. And that landscape went from 90% of it being open for logging to 85% of it being conserved or legally off limits to logging, and an advancement in human well-being. Implementation is still underway, and there are always some bumpy periods with that, but I think that's really formed a blueprint of kind of social justice and conservation blueprint for conservation in other parts of the world. So proud of that. Our work on Nextgen, and just with people like Margaret Atwood on showing that it's possible to produce high quality publications using wheat straw and flax straw rather than high carbon value forests, I think was just innovative and creative, and has kind of sparked kind of a broader stream of our work. And then we've been doing some really fun work in the fashion industry of late.
Great. A related question, I'm wondering about some of your biggest lessons or aha moments along the way that maybe have played a key role in your success. For example, I've been wondering about when you founded Canopy 20 years ago, if you already knew the kinds of partnerships that you would have to form with some very, very big players, and working with startups in our accelerators, oftentimes who have technologies, for example, for mining oil and gas. It's very hard for a small fish to work with a big fish sometimes. So those are the kinds of lessons along the way that I would imagine you've had, and I'd love to hear more of what those lessons might have been.
Oh, for sure. Like as we said at the start, I was a physiotherapist and a former athlete. Like what did I know about running in an environmental NGO and working with business? But I think one of the key things is being really clear about sort of where your compass is taking you. And you have to ask for what you want, right? Like for us at Canopy, that's determined by what's needed ecologically and how that fits with kind of a just, socially just pathway forward. But you have to ask for what you want, because otherwise you're never going to get it. Don't sort of be talking yourself back from like what's actually needed. Clearly, I think any entrepreneur, social entrepreneurs, that you've got to take risks. And it's kind of like skiing. If you're not falling over, then you're not pushing your edge enough. And we need to be shifting the dial on these really critical issues faster and in kind of larger magnitudes than we are. I think it's easy. There are so many things that come at you, especially if you're kind of in a startup or, just in the social justice movement or kind of a growing social entrepreneurial enterprise. And so not sweating the small stuff, being really focused on what your role is, what you do well, identifying who your partners are, choosing them wisely. And then the other thing is that you can get a lot of things done if you don't care who gets the credit. So that helps sometimes as well. Yeah, great lessons. You seem to have 4 kind of main campaign areas that are active at the moment: the Canopy Style, the Pack for Good, Paper Futures, and Protecting Ancient and Endangered Forests. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those campaigns. Sure. So our work is really geared towards driving change through unsustainable linear supply chains that are currently driving the loss of vital forest ecosystems. So one of kind of the buckets that we see our work as fitting under is the kind of generating market conditions and market leverage and incentives to drive a change back through the supply chain. So that's where our Canopy Style and Pack for Good and Paper Futures initiatives would fit. With Canopy Style, there's like 200 million trees disappearing into viscose and rayon fabrics every year. It's going to double within the next decade. And because it's at that inflection point, we have this ability to make sure those 200 million trees aren't coming from really critical places. But also to redirect this supply chain to be fundamentally more circular and sustainable. And so that transition to a circular economy production is something that's a big priority for us within that work. And we currently have more than 340 brand partners, so big guys like H&M and Zara and Levi's, and pace setters like Stella McCartney and Eileen Fisher, and many in between. But their shared kind of revenues of $600 billion, or there plus or minus a little bit, has enabled us to really galvanize the attention of the viscose producers. And so viscose producers that represent 90% of global production now have similar commitments in place, and 52%, or more than half of global viscose supply, is now verified with a green shirt or at low risk of sourcing from high carbon forests. So that's happened within the last 5 to 7 years. We've been working with brands for 7 years, from viscose producers in a more concerted way for 5 years. Like shifting a global supply chain in 5 years is kind of exactly the scale and pace of change that we need to be seeing at these times. And now we're starting to see the first next gen kind of products to market. So that's our work with Canopy Style. Pack for Good is working on the packaging industry, which is massive. When people think of packaging, they generally think of plastic packaging, and plastic packaging bad. I think of Amazon boxes. Well, there you go. Right. Yeah. There's like 3 billion trees that disappear into Amazon boxes and all the other kind of paper-based packaging that we all have tumbling into our houses and offices every day. And so Pack for Good's really focused on making sure that, again, these really ancient and endangered forest ecosystems aren't being destroyed to make packaging, and working to create smarter design. So one of the brand partners that we work with they redesigned the box that they use between their warehouse and their store. They changed the design of the box and they changed their system so that they could reuse that box 7 to 8 times. And in doing so, they saved 85% resources and saved themselves $14 million.
Wow.
And so just smart design can move us so far down the track. So that's our Pack for Good initiative. We're doing a lot of work on next-gen solutions and diversifying the fiber basket that we use rather than us continuing to rely exclusively on tree fiber. So we've kind of popped out a 10-year infrastructure transition for the kind of global pulp paper packaging viscose production. It's called Survival, a pulp thriller. Comes with a $69 billion price tag over the next 10 years to get these game-changing disruptive technologies up and operating at scale. But, you know, 69 billion sounds a lot to probably you and me. But when you put it in the context of, you know, Joe Biden's just putting in place a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. The company that sells Botox sold for 68 billion in 2018, right? It's extra $1 billion to save the planet seems like a pretty good deal. And then, of course, all of that work is geared towards translating it through to change on the ground in critical landscapes like Canada's boreal forests, where we've been working with the Cree Grand Council for many years in support of their aspirations, conservation aspirations for their territory. The Great Bear Rainforest and Clayoquot Sound in British Columbia. We work in the Loser ecosystem and in other landscapes in Indonesia, and then obviously work to support. Our work is global in terms of landscapes, and so, you know, whether it's Brazil or Australia or Southeast Asia, then we're working to try and bring the power of the marketplace to help protect those areas.
Knowing that there's many entrepreneurs in our community and many entrepreneurs who will be watching now or reading the recap blog or watching the video later, I'm wondering a little bit about how you do that, how you work with brands like Levi's and others. I mean, how do you get your foot in the door, and especially doing that in different countries? What's your kind of approach or strategy for those kinds of partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little different now than what it was. Right. I mean, I have a flat forehead, as do a number of my colleagues, from beating our heads against the brick wall of and probably stopping just shy of a restraining order with the number of voicemails that we were placing to people. But you know, we're now known as, you know, a high value partner when it comes to sustainability, supply chain transformation work, but it takes tenacity. You have to be shameless, right? You have to be willing to pick up the phone and call, and then call again and call again, and just recognize that just because it's, you know, our priority doesn't mean that it's automatically the person on the other end of the phone's priority, given everything else that they're juggling. And so it's really been, so part of it is getting in the door, understanding what the value proposition is and what the priorities and realities are of the person on the other side, and what they're kind of grappling with, what the trends and pressures of their sector as a whole or their industry as a whole, as well as kind of uniquely kind of on their company and how their company's positioned within that. Because some companies want to be out ahead. What we've found oftentimes with sustainability is that it's almost the opposite of the Olympics. You know, oftentimes in the Olympics, people are kind of generally wanting to be first across the line. Sometimes with sustainability, people are kind of happy to be a very close second or third, but happy for someone else to, you know, break the tape first.
Right.
So just having an understanding of who are the brands, who are the executives that are actually more likely to be kind of the champions that are going to pioneer the path, and then what do they need to be able to, you know, actually do it, and making it as easy as possible.
Great. So a lot of this work, as you mentioned, is leveraging the power of the marketplace and working with these kind of very big players. And then you've hinted at it, but of course, in the context of climate work, we're often talking about a just transition. So we're thinking specifically about how to ensure that the rights, knowledge, beliefs, and interests of workers and indigenous peoples are represented. And I often like to call out in these conversations, just because I think generally, especially in the work that I do in clean tech, we don't really talk about the role of activism enough. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, at least 330 environmental defenders were killed globally last year, and the majority of those deaths being people who worked in defense of land and environmental rights and indigenous rights. And I think certainly just speaking for the field that I'm a part of in entrepreneurship and clean tech, we often fail to kind of acknowledge and recognize the important role of activism and the huge, immense sacrifice that often has to be paid. But really, activism helps to shift the Overton window, shift the policy, and then creates this enabling environment. That was a bit of a rant, but back to your.
I quote that number often as well. Right?
Yeah,
like 331.
So important to acknowledge.
Frontline defenders lost their lives last year, and the number wasn't that much less the year before. Right, this number has been consistently climbing.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering, with the work that you do, which I totally understand in terms of like going where the big impact can be had. I mean, changing the supply chains of one big company, just has such an outsized impact. But so I'm wondering, in this work, how you ensure what we've talked about, representation from different communities, and then ensuring that they have a seat at the table in this kind of work that you do.
Yeah, so I mean, we're really conscious that at Canopy we're working on one kind of, like, we think it's an important piece, but it's part of a kind of a broader mosaic of issues, right? Like we don't work on forced labor or chemicals and pollution, but we're lucky to work alongside organizations that do really great work on those issues. And so we always, we're quite clear with our brand partners what we're working with them on, and then also what we can't, kind of what we don't have the in-house expertise to work with them on. And we definitely kind of recommend other organizations and pathways forward. But I think it is really important, right? Like, I mean, both from a justice perspective as well as from a conservation perspective. Like, there's study after study that lands that are under kind of traditional community management or the traditional lands where there hasn't been an erosion of those communities actually having tenure and ownership over their lands, that consistently way higher levels of conservation in those lands. And so for us, our work is really geared around being an NGO. You're an influencer rather than a decision maker. And so our role is to try and build as much influence for environmental change as we can. The marketplace and working with brand partners is one of those ways to build influence for a broader environmental and social justice agenda. And what we've found is that with mobilizing and bringing the attention of the marketplace to areas, we've been able to help provide support and lift for, both here in Canada as well as internationally, for, Indigenous communities who sometimes for decades have been advocating for a conservation vision for their lands. That's happened here in Canada in a number of cases, where it wasn't until the marketplace started to pay a little bit more attention that it popped for provincial governments as a priority to move forward. Like, this definitely what happened in the Great Bear Rainforest. It's also happened in the Boreal Forest. I think it's really important for, here in Canada, governments need to be financially supporting First Nations so they have the resources to be able to sit and participate in the tables in meaningful ways. Encouraged that in the recent federal government, there was just over $3 billion that was dedicated to conservation as part of the protecting 30% by 2030. A lot of that has to go to First Nations because it's going to be their land that's going to be conserved, depending on where it is. Globally, we work in a lot of places where it's just not safe for local activists to be at the negotiations table with producers, or even necessarily kind of at the negotiations table with government representatives.
Right.
And so, especially with producer companies, as you referred to, they're paying, like they're literally putting their bodies on the line. They're, being attacked and intimidated and jailed and killed. And so working as an international NGO, we can sit at the negotiations table, but we have to consult deeply and meaningfully with our local partners and coordinate with them and ensure that we are accurately reflecting and conveying what their needs and vision are within those forums.
Yeah.
And at junctures that they feel comfortable with being kind of engaged and included within those discussions, then we always look for those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. You made a comment earlier about anyone drinking or anyone reading the newspaper regularly will want to reach for a bottle of wine,
right?
Which is totally accurate. And one piece of news that I saw this week in The Guardian that made me think of this conversation that we were going to have is the $55 million US deal between the government of Sierra Leone and China to build an industrial fishing harbor on 250 acres of beach and protected rainforest. And I think it's actually to like grind up fish, local fish, which is abundant in sardines for the fish farming industry. So the local groups have called it a catastrophic human and ecological disaster. And it's just one of the more recent examples of the tensions that can exist between industry, economic growth, and environmental rights and protections. And certainly, as you've pointed out, one we've seen play out in Canada many, many, many times. And so I'm wondering what you think needs to happen at a policy level here and abroad for us to build an economy that values and protects the world's forests while also addressing income disparities.
Yeah, well, and I would question or be interested in how much that development will help with alleviation of local kind of poverty indices, or will improve human well-being locally and kind of median household income and those kind of indices. Because oftentimes the kind of popular economic paradigm of trickle-down economics, it's kind of fairly marginal in terms of the how it reaches the communities that are losing sort of, their traditional lands or rainforests and kind of local fish supplies and things like that. Like we have to find another way, right? Like I think if nothing else with COVID, it's really shown that, well, A, we can change our economies overnight if we're suitably motivated. B, that if we continue down this path, like since the early 2000s, we've had Ebola, SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19. They're all like 75% of the diseases that we are grappling with as humanity are crossing the human-animal barrier. And increasingly, they're coming because we're logging and disturbing intact forest habitats that are unleashing these pathogens that we have no resistance to. And so, the social harm and the economic upheaval of the last year, like there's only so many more COVIDs that we want to go through. And so I think, even from a self-preservation perspective, from a health front, there should be kind of clear incentive for protecting forest ecosystems, on not to mention the critical role that they play in stabilizing climate and biodiversity. And if those two ecological crises continue forward, like as the freight trains that they currently are, then again, as a species will be in trouble. So I think, what underscores conservation is that it has to be socially durable. It has to be just. Otherwise, conservation doesn't last, right? Like I know decades ago, they kind of used to put sort of, the approach to conservation was like, oh, you stick a fence around an area, you pop a sign on it, say it's a park, and then that's it. Conservation has to advance justice, and it has to be viable for communities that are going to continue to live there, whether it's in Indonesia or in, was it Sierra Leone that or here in Canada, right, in the Great Bear Rainforest. And there has to be a third door. It can't just be everything's kind of, 100% protected and we're not sort of, utilizing what it has, or we're just going to bulldoze it. Like as a species, we pride ourselves on being really smart and evolved. And so let's bring that creativity that we have to build vibrant conservation-based economies, a circular economy where, this whole construct of waste that we have as a species is like, there's no such thing as waste in nature. Everything's constantly sort of part of the perpetual cycle. And so building circular economies, the kind of advancement of renewables on the energy side, looking and developing at conservation-based economies and where those kind of co-economies or co-products can exist. There's so many opportunities that we just need to stop taking the easy path, the very simple kind of duality path.
Yeah, beautifully said. On your comment on trickle-down economics, President Biden tweeted, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that trickle-down economics does not work, folks. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, coming from the President of the United States, that's some kind of progress.
Totally. Him saying it, I wasn't aware of that tweet, but him saying it has a lot more punch, obviously, than me saying it.
We'll open up for questions soon, so I encourage people to put their questions in the questions section. But I wanted to touch on the work that you've mentioned around next generation solutions, because we have so many entrepreneurs watching or who will watch later and a part of our community. I'm wondering if you can tell us about some of these next gen solutions and also areas in which you see a big need and opportunity for innovation and entrepreneurship when it comes to protecting and preserving our forests.
Yeah, so the first big thing around being able to protect and conserve our forests is, people aren't going to stop wearing clothes or, like paper, packaging, clothing. It's all integrated into modern day life. And so our work isn't about eliminating that. It's just about finding more sustainable, truly sustainable ways to meet those needs. And Nextgen is the future, right? The circular economy is the future pathway forward. It's just socially and environmentally lighter on so many levels. And so we are working to kickstart commercial scale production of next generation solution alternatives to just virgin, high carbon, high biodiversity value forest products. You can use waste textiles. 85% of the textiles and clothing that we all wear ultimately ends up in landfill, it degrades into methane. Agricultural residues that are left over as a byproduct of the food grain harvest, or microbial cellulose, which is that cool, crazy science of growing cellulose kind of in a test tube off the waste of, like if a coconut water plant has coconut residues as part of that production system, that can actually be used to then generate cellulosic product. And so we need more tech innovators. Like, I am not the chemistry major, but this is where the geeks shall inherit the earth. They're going to be our solution pathway forward. So just smart technology that helps substitute for tree fiber. We definitely, and Canopy's already working with 25 to 30 really kind of fantastic game-changing technologies. Market demand, of course, like having strong market pull-through is really important, and having brands and companies that are willing to step in and be part of forging these new supply chains. Government can create a lot of the enabling conditions both in terms of incubator programs, grants, favorable loans, tax incentives, regulations around the imports that will be accepted, the way that they can set up and enable the back part of the supply chain. Like at the moment, we don't actually have collection and aggregation at scale for clothing. And then the big missing link is investment, right? Like the North America's first wheat straw pulp mill is now up and operating in Eastern Washington State. It took them 4 years to find their equity. And we can't wait 4 years for each of these game-changing technologies to find their equity to then unlock their debt package and build. So we just need to compress it all down, which is part of our work in the world. But if other folks are in there as well, then it'll move that much faster.
Great, thank you. And then I'll pass it to Shay. I'll have one closing question, but Shay's been monitoring our Q&A.
Sure.
Fascinating conversation. Lots of questions rolling in, which is great. So I think I'll start maybe by building on the last points around innovation and solutions. So there's a couple of questions. One from, let me just pull it up, around mycelium. Oh no, where is it? From Andrew. So there's been lots of talk about using mycelium, mushroom roots as alternative packaging. Do you see this as a viable, scalable alternative to plastics and trees? One specific on solutions?
Yeah, I mean, some technologies work great at a small scale and they don't work at larger scale, but there are some really interesting innovations in the mycelium space. And we've seen a number of them that, from a technical performance perspective, are great. And we've kind of gotten a little bit under the hood on some of their business plans, and at scale, a couple of them look quite promising, actually. So, yeah.
Great. Other questions about, I know that you focus more on the supply side. What about demand? Like Charlotte's asking about, I mean, basically we all consume too much stuff. Are you doing anything on kind of behavior change in that regard? And then kind of relatedly, Brian's asking about, education for us as individuals and communities and consumers, putting pressure on the companies themselves, or do you not engage in that work?
Yeah, so we're a relatively small and modestly resourced organization. Like, we now feel huge. We've got 20 people. A couple of years ago, we were still sort of like 10 folks. And so most of our time is really focused on working with these large customer companies. We do have, like most organizations in today's world, we have social media kind of channels, multiple social media channels. And so our Instagram channel tends to be more of and it's Canopy Planet across all of our channels is where we do more kind of education engagement. That's more of a kind of global citizen oriented comms. Our other channels tend to be more geared towards our business partners and audiences. But brands rely on global citizens as their customers, right? And so engaging your brands to see if they're working and prioritizing sustainability, if they're kind of, using packaging or clothing, or like, are they working with Canopy? If not, then, why not? If they are, congratulating them. Like, people have a lot of individuals. We have a lot of influence over brands, be it via social media or a direct kind of email and engagement. So, so I wouldn't underestimate that at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure as a group, we could probably generate some examples of really successful campaigns where people pressured companies, for sure.
Totally.
So on your focus then, given you can't do it all, focus on the companies that you work with. So a couple questions. One from Josh: how do you assess which corporations or companies, maybe broadly speaking, to work with, or like those that might be near that kind of tipping point or amenable to greening? And then relatedly, a question from David around how does the forest industry or logging industry respond to your work? I know that you work with a lot of people in forests, so.
So when we start down a path of, okay, we're going to work to ensure that viscose doesn't drive deforestation and forest degradation, then we'll look at, okay, who are the companies that buy that, and so fashion brands, and then we'll do an analysis of, which brands are consistently leaders on these kinds of things, which ones tend to wait until there's a certain amount of critical momentum behind an initiative until they step in, and then we that then informs us as to how we prioritize our time and how we frame and our engagement with brands. We develop deep transformational collaborative partnerships with brands. With the forest industry producers, we're probably less popular. Well, we're definitely less popular. We don't receive many kind of holiday seasons cards or any kind of gift baskets, which is not what we're aspiring to anyway. But we do work with our brand partners to engage their suppliers to shift. And I think, it's human nature. Change is hard. It's difficult for many of us. Many of us will set New Year's resolutions, and then by the end of January, we're still sitting on the couch eating potato chips rather than going to the gym. Okay? And so for large companies that have vested interests, like millions or sometimes billions of dollars worth of infrastructure, then asking them to kind of stop logging in these kind of critical areas and change their production methodology over to a different feed source. It's not a small endeavor that we're asking them for, even though it's absolutely critical. And so it really is about being very clear and bringing as many solutions as we can to the table. And yeah, I would say we have some companies and producers within the forest industry that I think have seen that there's really a pivot happening at a societal level and within the marketplace, and that sustainability is on the front burner, and that this is the direction that they need to head, and they need to prioritize Nextgen and getting out of high carbon and socially controversial areas. And then there are others that are just hoping if they keep their head down and stay out of the line of view for long enough that they'll be able to kind of continue forward. So there's a range.
I'm having flashbacks of dinner table fights with my stepdad, who used to work with the Council of Forest Industries in BC. Anyways, but just building on that question, a question from me about so is it a change in methodology, and or is it a matter of, in some ways, just stopping certain practices, like stopping clear cutting, stopping logging in certain areas, or stopping logging altogether, like a phase out? I'm just reminded of like oil and gas, the conversations around fossil fuels too.
Yeah, I mean, logging in high carbon value forests is akin to fossil fuel and tar sand extraction, right? Like we don't have the ability in our carbon constrained world to continue logging old growth forests, and so that needs to stop. And we need to transition to more sustainable forest management at lower volumes on areas that aren't identified as high carbon or high biodiversity value forests. Basically, the scientific community are very clear. We need to protect 30 to 50% of the world's forests by 2030. That means that we have to significantly reduce the amount of logging that's happening. And we need to ensure that it's not continuing to happen in these really critical high carbon and high biodiversity value, the ancient and endangered forest areas. That means there should be protection of those forests that are still old growth and standing. And there needs to be significant restoration of areas that have already been degraded.
Thank you for that. And then last question from the group, kind of circling back to where we started. So a question from David. what are your thoughts about increasing indigenous control? In his case, he's noted of logging and mining resources, and he's noted writing from Art Manual, Reconciliation Manifesto. Do you see a big shift in the conversation with a shift of access, or conservation rather, with a shift of access? I would expand that out maybe in terms of indigenous rights to land and the movement for land back. What's the conversation look like in the conservation world around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely there's it's an integrated part of the conversation. When I started Canopy 22 years ago, I think it was less of an integrated part of conservation dialogue and dialogue within kind of the environmental movement as a kind of like as a siloed thing. Like there's a lot more dynamism and fluidity. There's a lot more kind of recognition of the importance of just conservation, as well as kind of like a broadening of the movement. So yeah, I think
I've certainly noticed that myself.
Shifted a lot.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Shay. And just a last question. Well, it's a 2-in-1. The first is how can people get involved in your work or help support it? And the second part is what's giving you hope these days?
Oh. Well, I think I mentioned probably one way that you can get involved is engage brands or companies that you buy from. Are they working with Canopy? Are they sourcing from Ancient and Endangered Forests? If not, then pop them our way. Follow us on our socials. Feel free to kind of volunteer or donate. Take someone that perhaps cares less about forests than you do. Take them on a walk or camping, even if it's just down around your local park, because have them connect with forests because we protect what we care about. So that's one piece. And then what am I feeling hopeful for? I would say one of the things, as devastating as COVID has been and continues to be, obviously, on so many levels, that within COVID, it's shown the pace of change that can happen, that we literally can change overnight if needed. And then the other thing is that, oftentimes when there have been hardships, economic hardships, historically, sustainability has kind of moved to the back burner. And in COVID times, sustainability, if anything, is kind of further on the front burner. It's on the rise. And even though some of the kind of dinosaur industries have kind of fired back up in the immediate sort of wake of COVID, I think it's really clear that we're going to be transitioning. And there's an awareness that supply chains and the way that we interact with our natural world needs to transition. So that makes me hopeful.
Me too. Definitely noticed that shift. Well, we're at the end of our time, so I just want to thank you sincerely. And we'll be making this recording available, and we'll be recapping it as a blog so people in the audience can help share it. And I want to thank our audience for joining us. And this will be our last one for the summer. We know there's serious Zoom fatigue, and people will be outside, hopefully walking with and talking to and hugging trees. And then we'll be reconvening in September. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Barnaby.
you.
See you, Shay.
Pleasure.